Hello and welcome to this lab demonstration on creating vSAN storage policies. At the beginning of this lab, we already need to be familiar with the concept of data stores, vSAN, storage vMotion, and storage policies. In this lab, we will examine the default storage policy, then we will create a custom policy with no failure tolerance. After that, we are going to assign a custom policy to a VM, then we will make the VM compliant to the policy, and finally we will create an invalid storage policy. I'm sure I provided you enough good reasons to watch the following video on creating vSAN storage policies, so let's get started. Our first task is to examine the default storage policy which can be used by our virtual machines. So let's go to our menu. Let's go to Policies and Profiles. Let's see the VM Storage Policies section. Now we are going to find the default storage policy for the vSAN technology. So here it is, vSAN storage policy. Let's click on Edit Settings. Now we can see the name of this policy and the description. It is default, so we cannot change the name and the description of this policy. Let's click on Next. And here on the second page, on the vSAN page, on the Availability tab, we can see the site disaster tolerance configuration of this particular policy. It is none for a standard cluster. And here we can see a failures to tolerate for this particular policy. It is set to one failure by using the technology which is called RAID 1 in mirroring state. So our virtual machines, which can be assigned with this policy, will double their storage on a vSAN storage because of this particular mirroring policy. So here we can see that for every 100 gigabyte VM disk of any example VM, we will actually use 200 gigabytes of vSAN storage space. So here we can tolerate one particular failure of a vSAN data store. We do not need to choose any of those settings, so let's click on Cancel. Instead of changing the default policy, we are going to create our own new custom policy with no failure tolerance to be able to experiment with our virtual machines. So let's click on Create VM Storage Policy. Let's name it vSAN Custom Policy Fault Tolerance 0. Let's click on Next. Let's choose Enable Rules for vSAN Storage option here. Let's click on Next. In the vSAN configuration page, we see a similar page with the Availability tab. Let's choose the No Redundancy option here. Just for the experiment purposes, we are going to create this particular policy. Here we can see that we are going to consume only 100 gigabytes of disk space for any VM which has a size of 100 gigabytes. So we are not going to create any data mirroring rules here. So let's click on Next. Here we can see that the only compatible storage here is our vSAN data store. Let's click on Next. Let's verify the configuration we have done here. We are going to create a policy which is going to be named vSAN Custom Policy Fault Tolerance 0. Its availability configuration will include none for site disaster tolerance and no data redundancy for failures to tolerate, just as we want. So let's click on Finish. Here we can find that our policy has been successfully created, vSAN Custom Policy FTT0. Now we can use it for our virtual machines. Let's go to our menu section. Let's go to Hosts and Clusters. Let's locate our Photon01 VM. And now, for the sake of the experiment, let's clone this virtual machine. let's create a clone VM. We are going to clone it to another virtual machine. Let's call this VM payload 02. Let's click on next. Now we are going to locate this virtual machine. We are going to place this virtual machine to our SA E6i05 E6i host. Let's click on next. Now, we do not see our vSAN data store as compatible here because currently we are not going to use any particular storage policy. Let's use the default option here. Let's click on upscale data store storage here. We can see that this data store does not match current VM policy because our Photon01 VM has a particular storage policy from a previous lab. So let's click on next. Now we do not need to customize this virtual machine hardware. We are just going to power on this virtual machine after creation. So let's click on next and verify our configuration. We are going to clone a Photon01 VM to another VM, which we are going to call payload 02. This will be located on an SA E6i05 E6i host. It will be located on an upscale data store here in this lab, and we are going to start this VM to power on this VM upon the creation. Now let's click on finish. Here we can see that our virtual machine has been created and has been started. Now let's change its storage policy to a different one. Let's right click on this virtual machine. Let's choose VM policies, edit VM storage policies. And let's choose our newly created storage policy, which is called vSAN custom policies FTT0. Now, here we can see that our disks, our virtual machine disks, have this triangle sign with an exclamation mark inside it. This is because this virtual machine is currently located in an upscale data store, which is not a vSAN data store. It's a classic VMFS data store, and our vSAN custom policy requires this VM to be located on a vSAN data store. So we will skip it right now. Let's click on OK. Now we can actually see that our virtual machine is still located on an upscale data store. Let's go back to Summary tab. Let's scroll down and we will see that our virtual machine has a storage policy assigned vSAN custom policy FTT0 and its policy compliance is unknown. Let's refresh the page and we can see that it is not applicable here because our virtual machine is not located where this policy wants this VM to be located. So let's continue. Let's make the VM compliant. So we need to migrate this virtual machine to another data store. Let's click on our payload 02 virtual machine. Let's click on migrate. Now we are going to change the storage only for this virtual machine. Let's click on next. On this particular page, we can see that only vSAN data store is assigned as a compatible data store for our virtual machine because of the storage policy configuration. So what we are going to choose? We are going to choose this particular vSAN data store. Now we are going to click on next. And now let's verify. We are going to change only the storage option for our virtual machine. We are going to migrate the payload 02 virtual machine. Storage will be vSAN data store with a VM storage policy, vSAN custom policy. It was taken by default from our original payload 02 VM before the migration. So let's click on finish. Let's wait a bit for this VM to be migrated. We just need a couple of seconds for this procedure to be completed. And it's completed right now. So let's see that the status of our virtual machine has changed from the not applicable to a compliant state. So now this virtual machine is located where the storage policy wants. So the last part of this lab is that we are going to specifically create an invalid storage policy and to see how vCenter will show us that this policy has some possible problems. So let's go to menu section. Let's find our policies and profiles sections. Let's go to VM storage policy on the navigation pane. Let's try to create a new VM storage policy. Let's call it RAID 5 and click on next. What we are going to do here, we are going to select the enable rules for vSAN storage again. Let's click on next. And in the vSAN section of this policy configuration, we are going to select the different failures to tolerate option. Let's choose a RAID 5 erasure coding option with one possible failure. Here we can see that vCenter advises us that the consumed storage space for every 100 gigabyte VM disk would consume 133 gigabytes of disk space because of the idea behind the RAID 5 erasure coding technology. So let's click on next. And here on this page, we can see that we do not have any compatible storage. We do not have any storage compatible with this particular policy with the RAID 5 erasure coding option here. So why this is happening? This is happening because there are no vSAN storage here, which includes at least 4 failures domain or fault domains. For example, hosts. We have only one vSAN storage, which is called vSAN data store, and it includes only 3 ESXi hosts. So it is not applicable to our RAID policy. Still, let's click on next here. Let's try to create this policy. Again, let's verify we are going to create a policy which is called RAID 5. It has one failure to tolerate with the RAID 5 erasure coding technology behind it. Other options are set to the default state. Let's click on finish. We can see that this policy has been successfully created. vCenter does not know that this policy is created by the experiment, so we are going to try to assign this policy to some VM. Let's go to menu, hosts and clusters. Let's again locate our payload 02 virtual machine. Let's try to assign a policy to it. Let's right click on it and choose a VM policies, edit VM storage policies. And let's choose our previously created policy, which it was called RAID 5. Here it is. Now we can see again those triangle signs with exclamation marks on our virtual disks. And here we can see the description of this particular problem. This policy specified requires 4 fault domains contributing all flash storage, but only 3 found. So our vSAN data store does not comply to our particular policy chosen here. We cannot successfully locate this virtual machine with a compliant status of its policy. So let's click on cancel. Here we are not going to migrate this VM, or we are not going to assign a wrong policy to it. So let's just delete this experimental policy. Again, let's go to menu, let's go to policies and profiles, storage policies, let's find our RAID 5 policy and let's delete it. We do not need it anymore. So now this policy is deleted and our lab is completed. Congratulations, you have completed the Creating vSAN Storage Policies lab demonstration video. During this lab, we have seen how and where we can create a custom storage policy with specific settings, how we can assign a custom policy to a VM, what do we need to do to make a VM compliant to a policy, and finally, how we can create an invalid storage policy. Thank you for watching this lab demonstration video. I hope the knowledge acquired here will help you with your daily job assignments, and good luck as you continue your journey in VMware world.